President Trump's talk of annexing Canada through economic coercion sounded, at first, like political theater. But when the United States officially imposed massive tariffs on aluminum under Section 232, raising duties to as much as 50%, the confrontation moved from rhetoric to reality. Washington justified the move in the familiar language of national security, industrial resilience, and strategic independence. But in Ottawa, the response was very different from what many in Washington expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no immediate retaliation, no symbolic counter-tariffs. Instead, Canada chose a quieter, far more dangerous path. It let the market do the damage. Canada is not just another supplier of aluminum to the United States. It is by far the largest one. For decades, North American industry has been built around this reality. Canadian aluminum, produced mostly with cheap and clean hydroelectric power, flows south and becomes the backbone of American cars, planes, buildings, and military equipment. This interdependence was never accidental. It was the result of geography, infrastructure, and long-term industrial integration. And it is precisely this interdependence that the new tariffs put at risk. When Washington announced the 50% tariffs, the immediate expectation in political circles was that Canada would respond politically, a complaint at the WTO, a package of countermeasures, a public escalation. None of that happened. Instead, Canadian producers and traders began to do something far more effective. They adjusted prices, they adjusted contracts, and most importantly, they adjusted destinations. From the perspective of the global aluminum market, the signal was subtle but unmistakable. The United States had suddenly become a less attractive destination, not because of any official Canadian decree, but because tariffs had distorted the economics. For Canadian producers, selling into the U.S. now meant dealing with policy risk, uncertainty, and artificial price ceilings. Meanwhile, Europe, Japan, and South Korea were willing to pay market prices without political interference. The result was inevitable. More Canadian aluminum started flowing elsewhere. Less was earmarked for the U.S. And when supply tightens, prices rise. This is how the counterstrike began. Quietly, invisibly, but with immediate consequences. Inside the United States, aluminum buyers soon discovered what analysts described as a double price shock. On one side, there was the tariff itself, a brutal 50% surcharge imposed by Washington. On the other side, there was the gradual upward adjustment of Canadian export prices as suppliers reoriented toward global markets. The combination pushed the effective cost of aluminum for American buyers far above anything seen in recent years. This was not a theoretical concern. It was a real, immediate hit to balance sheets. And aluminum is not a niche input. It is a foundational material across the American economy. In the automotive sector, it is everywhere. Vehicle frames, body panels, powertrain components. Even a modest increase in aluminum prices can translate into hundreds of dollars per vehicle when multiplied across production volumes. For manufacturers like General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, the timing could not be worse. They are already dealing with higher labor costs, massive investments in electrification, and tightening margins. The tariffs add another layer of pressure in an already unforgiving market. The aerospace sector faces a similar, though slower, squeeze. Aircraft manufacturing relies heavily on aluminum alloys for structural components. Companies like Boeing operate under long-term contracts negotiated years in advance. They cannot simply pass sudden cost increases on to customers without renegotiation. The result is margin compression and production planning chaos in an industry already under scrutiny for delays and cost overruns. Construction tells the same story. Aluminum is used in commercial buildings, residential projects, and infrastructure. When prices rise, contractors face higher costs that ripple through entire projects. Public infrastructure is particularly vulnerable because budgets are often fixed years in advance. When material costs jump unexpectedly, projects are delayed, scaled back, or require additional public funding. For taxpayers, this is where trade war policy becomes painfully concrete. Even the defense sector, the very sector Washington claims to protect with these tariffs, is not spared. Military vehicles, aircraft, naval vessels, and weapons systems all depend on aluminum and aluminum alloys. Higher input costs mean higher procurement costs at a time when defense budgets are already under pressure from inflation. The contradiction is obvious. A policy justified in the name of national security ends up making national security more expensive. Beyond individual industries, the macroeconomic signals start to flash. Producer price indices begin to reflect higher metal costs. Those costs eventually filter into consumer prices. Cars, appliances, housing components, all become more expensive. What began as a trade policy maneuver turns into a daily economic reality for American households. Employment risk follows quickly behind. When margins are squeezed, companies look for places to cut costs. In capital-intensive industries, labor is often the most flexible variable. Tariffs are supposed to protect jobs, but higher input costs can undermine that goal by making U.S. manufacturers less competitive globally. Over time, that means fewer exports, delayed investments, and eventually, layoffs. What makes this phase so remarkable is that none of it required Canada to fire a single political shot. There was no formal retaliation, no headline-grabbing announcement, just a quiet shift in supply and pricing that proved more powerful than any press conference. The market absorbed the signal and translated it into higher costs for the United States. And this is the first great lesson of this trade war. Once tariffs are imposed, control begins to slip from governments to markets. Supply chains adjust, contracts are rewritten, capital flows move. Even if politicians later want to de-escalate, reversing these shifts can take years. The aluminum story is not just about metal, it is about leverage, about how in an interconnected economy, quiet adjustments can hurt more than loud threats, and about how the first real battlefield of this US-Canada trade war is not diplomacy, but price. Once the price shock hit, the official response in Washington followed a familiar pattern. The tariffs, officials argued, were painful in the short term, but necessary in the long term. The logic was simple. Higher prices would encourage domestic production, idle smelters would restart, new investments would flow, and the United States would gradually reduce its dependence on foreign aluminum, especially Canadian aluminum. In theory, this made sense. In reality, the aluminum industry is not something that can be rebuilt on a political timetable. The first obstacle is energy. Aluminum smelting is one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes in the world. In Canada, most aluminum is produced using abundant hydroelectric power, which is both cheap and low carbon. This gives Canadian producers a structural advantage that has nothing to do with trade policy. In the United States, electricity prices are higher, more volatile, and often more carbon-intensive. Even with tariffs in place, this cost difference makes it extremely difficult for American smelters to compete on price. The second obstacle is time. The United States today operates only a small number of primary aluminum smelters, and many of them run below full capacity due to years of underinvestment. Restarting an idled smelter is not like flipping a switch. It requires major refurbishment, regulatory approvals, and long-term power contracts. Building a new smelter is even more daunting. Industry estimates suggest that from permitting to full operation, a new primary aluminum facility can take close to a decade. The capital requirements run into the billions of dollars, and investors must believe that the policy environment will remain stable for decades, not just for one political cycle. This is where the trade war introduces a fatal contradiction. Tariffs are, by definition, political instruments. They can be raised, lowered, expanded, or removed with a change of administration or a shift in diplomatic priorities. For investors, that uncertainty is poison. No company wants to commit billions of dollars to a project that only makes sense if protection remains in place for 20 or 30 years. As a result, the very tool meant to stimulate domestic investment ends up discouraging it. The third obstacle is scale. Even under optimistic assumptions, the United States cannot quickly replace the volume of aluminum it imports from Canada. Canadian producers supply millions of tons per year to the U.S. market. Replacing that capacity would require not just one or two new smelters, but an entire industrial renaissance. That is not impossible in theory, but it is completely unrealistic in the time frame of a trade war. Turning to alternative foreign suppliers does not solve the problem either. Producers in the Middle East, Asia, and parts of Europe can supply aluminum, but distance increases transportation costs and complicates logistics. Longer supply chains are more vulnerable to disruption, whether from geopolitical tensions, shipping bottlenecks, or energy market volatility. For American manufacturers that rely on just-in-time delivery, these risks translate into higher inventory costs and operational uncertainty. Environmental constraints make substitution even harder. Canadian aluminum is widely recognized as low carbon because it is produced mostly with hydroelectric power. In contrast, much of the aluminum produced in other parts of the world relies on coal or gas. As American and Canadian companies face increasing pressure from regulators, investors, and consumers to reduce emissions, sourcing higher carbon aluminum creates compliance and reputational risks. For industries like automotive and aerospace, where sustainability reporting has become a strategic priority, this is not a minor issue. It is a boardroom-level concern. There is also the question of quality and specification. Many American manufacturers have spent decades integrating Canadian aluminum into their production processes. Specific alloys, tolerances, and supply characteristics are baked into designs and certifications. Switching suppliers is not simply a matter of price. It requires testing, recertification, and sometimes redesign of components. These processes take time and money. During a trade war, that transition becomes even more painful. From a national security perspective, the irony is striking. Defense systems rely on specialized aluminum alloys that must meet strict performance and safety standards. Qualifying new suppliers for military applications involves long and complex approval processes. While the tariffs are justified as a way to protect national security, the The short-term effect is to increase costs and slow procurement. Measures intended to enhance resilience end up introducing new vulnerabilities. The labor argument also deserves scrutiny. Advocates of tariffs often emphasize job creation in upstream industries like primary aluminum production. But the reality is that aluminum-consuming industries employ far more workers than aluminum smelting itself. Autos, construction, aerospace, and defense together support millions of jobs across the United States. When aluminum prices rise, these sectors bear the cost. If higher input prices reduce output or competitiveness, job losses in downstream industries can easily outweigh any gains in upstream production. In that sense, the trade war does not eliminate risk, it reallocates it. Time remains the decisive variable. Even if everything goes right, even if new investments are announced tomorrow, meaningful expansion of U.S. aluminum capacity would take many years. During that period, manufacturers must continue to operate. Consumers must continue to buy. Infrastructure projects must continue to be built. The gap between policy intent and industrial reality becomes a source of constant economic friction. Tariffs raise costs immediately. Capacity adjusts slowly, if at all. In the meantime, Canada's strategic position actually strengthens. Despite being targeted by tariffs, Canada retains leverage through market fundamentals, rather than political retaliation. As long as global demand remains strong and alternatives remain limited, the United States faces a constrained set of choices. It can absorb higher costs. It can attempt gradual and expensive substitution, or it can revisit the tariff framework itself. This is the second great lesson of this trade war. In capital-intensive, energy-constrained, and highly integrated industries, tariffs do not function as a clean bargaining tool. They function as a price amplifier. They make everything more expensive faster than they make anything more resilient. And this brings us to the deeper strategic question. If the United States cannot quickly replace Canadian aluminum, and if raising prices mainly hurts its own industries, then what exactly is the endgame of this policy? That is where the story gets even more interesting. While Washington debates tariffs and replacement strategies, Canada has been executing a far more subtle and, in many ways, more effective response. There has been no dramatic press conference announcing retaliation. No symbolic list of American products targeted in return. No attempt to escalate the dispute in public. Instead, Ottawa has allowed market forces to do the work. And in a trade war, that can be far more powerful than any political statement. From Canada's perspective, an open confrontation carries real risks. Publicly declaring a price increase or announcing counter tariffs would invite further retaliation, deepen diplomatic tensions, and potentially frame the conflict as a political standoff rather than a commercial adjustment. Canada has long positioned itself as a predictable, rules-based trading partner, especially in its relationship with the United States. Preserving that image matters not only for bilateral trade, but also for Canada's credibility with Europe and Asia, which are watching this conflict closely. So instead of fighting in the headlines, Canada has been fighting in the spreadsheets. Canadian aluminum producers have quietly diversified their export destinations. Shipments to the European Union, Japan, and South Korea have increased. These markets value Canadian aluminum not only for its quality and reliability, but also for its low carbon profile thanks to hydroelectric production. Long-term contracts in these regions provide stable revenues and, more importantly, reduce exposure to political risk in the U.S. market. Every ton that goes to Europe or Asia is one less ton available to American buyers. No announcement is required. The market does the signaling. The effect inside the United States is exactly the same as if Canada had formally raised prices. Supply tightens. Competition for available volumes increases, and prices move upward. The difference is attribution. Instead of blaming Ottawa for retaliation, the pressure flows back to Washington's own tariff policy. The narrative shifts from foreign punishment to domestic consequence. This is a form of leverage that is extremely difficult to counter. You cannot sanction a market. You cannot negotiate with supply and demand. You can only react to them. And the global implications of this strategy go far beyond North America. Aluminum is a bellwether for broader industrial trends. When one of the world's largest and cleanest producers starts shifting export patterns, it affects price formation, trade flows, and investment decisions worldwide. European and Asian manufacturers facing lower input costs than their U.S. competitors suddenly gain a quiet advantage. In global markets for cars, aircraft, and industrial equipment, even small cost differences can translate into lost contracts and shrinking market share. For America's allies, this creates an uncomfortable balancing act. Many share Washington's concerns about supply security and strategic materials, but they also depend on open trade and predictable access to inputs. As the trade war drags on, firms and governments must decide whether to align fully with U.S. policy or to protect their own economic interests. Canada's approach shows that even the closest allies will hedge when uncertainty becomes structural. There is also a signaling effect for future trade conflicts. By avoiding overt retaliation, Canada preserves diplomatic space while still defending its interests. This reinforces a broader lesson. Leverage does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from patience, diversification, and a deep understanding of how markets actually work. From Washington's point of view, this makes the situation far more complex. Tariffs are designed to provoke clear, visible responses. When the response is diffuse and market-driven, measuring success becomes much harder. There is no single negotiation table where the pain can be exchanged for concessions. Instead, the cost shows up everywhere: in corporate budgets, in consumer prices, in investment plans. For American industries, the consequences are already visible. Automotive manufacturers face higher costs and tougher competition abroad. Aerospace firms see margins compressed. Construction projects struggle with rising budgets. And consumers gradually feel the impact through higher prices for vehicles, housing components, and durable goods. Inflation statistics start to reflect these pressures, and public sentiment follows. At the same time, something more structural is happening. Once supply chains begin to reorient, they develop inertia. New contracts are signed, new logistics routes are established, new commercial relationships are built. Even if tariffs are later reduced or removed, these changes do not automatically reverse. Path dependence sets in. The trade war stops being a temporary disruption and starts becoming a permanent reshaping of flows. This is where the risk of fragmentation appears. As more suppliers and buyers seek to reduce exposure to political risk, they retreat into regional or preferential arrangements. Efficiency declines, costs rise, duplication increases, innovation can slow. Aluminum is only one sector, but it illustrates how quickly this dynamic can spread to others. Canada's strategy, intentionally or not, accelerates this process. By reallocating supply and maintaining its image as a stable, rules-based exporter, it strengthens ties with partners who value predictability. For the United States, the relative position weakens. Not because America is less powerful, but because power is being exercised in a way that makes the US market look less reliable. And reliability is the invisible foundation of trade. There is also a political dimension. By keeping its response quiet, Canada avoids inflaming public opinion on either side of the border. This reduces the risk of a nationalist escalation spiral. At the same time, it ensures that the economic signal is not lost. The pain is real. It is just not accompanied by a diplomatic spectacle. In many ways, this is a more sophisticated form of statecraft. It recognizes that in modern trade wars, markets often move faster and more decisively than governments. For policymakers in Washington, this creates a dilemma. Escalating politically risks pushing even more supply away. Doing nothing allows the slow bleed to continue. And reversing course carries political costs at home. This is the third great lesson of this conflict. In an integrated global economy, you cannot easily force outcomes without reshaping the system itself. And once the system starts to reshape, you may not like where it ends up. Which brings us to the final and most important question. What does all of this mean for the long-term strategy of the United States and Canada? And whether this trade war is building resilience or quietly eroding it? As the aluminum dispute continues to reshape prices, supply chains, and political narratives, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This trade war is no longer about aluminum. It is about how power is exercised in a world where markets move faster than governments, and where leverage does not always come from confrontation. From Washington's perspective, the original objective seemed clear. Tariffs were meant to protect national security, rebuild domestic industrial capacity, and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. In theory, higher prices would attract investment, restart idle facilities, and restore a measure of economic sovereignty. But in practice, the first and most visible result has not been a surge in production. It has been a surge in costs. Inside the United States, aluminum prices adjusted almost immediately. Those higher costs spread through the economy in predictable ways. Automakers saw margins tighten. Aerospace firms struggled to absorb input inflation. Construction projects faced budget overruns. Defense procurement became more expensive. And consumers, slowly but inevitably, began to pay more for cars, appliances, and housing components. What began as a strategic trade measure turned into a broad-based cost distribution mechanism. Canada, meanwhile, did not need to escalate politically to protect its interests. By quietly reallocating supply and deepening relationships with other markets, it allowed economic gravity to do the work. The result was the same as a formal retaliation, but with far less diplomatic damage. This is an uncomfortable lesson for any country that believes power is only effective when it is visible. The deeper issue is strategic coherence. Tariffs on their own do not create industrial capacity. They only change prices. Without parallel investments in energy, infrastructure, workforce skills, and technology, higher prices simply make existing structures more expensive to operate. In the aluminum sector, structural disadvantages such as energy costs, environmental constraints, and capital intensity do not disappear because of a tariff. They remain, and they continue to shape outcomes. There is also a credibility problem. Long-term industrial investment requires long-term policy stability. When protection depends on political cycles and electoral outcomes, investors hesitate, they wait, or they take their capital elsewhere. In that environment, tariffs can become a signal of uncertainty rather than a signal of opportunity. For downstream industries, the picture is even starker. These sectors employ far more people than primary aluminum production ever will. When their costs rise and their competitiveness erodes, the economic and political consequences multiply. Jobs are at risk, exports become harder to defend, and the promised benefits of protection become harder to explain. At the international level, the consequences extend beyond North America. Allies and competitors are watching closely. They are learning that the U.S. market, once seen as the most stable and predictable destination, can become subject to sudden and politically driven shifts. In response, they hedge, they diversify, they reduce exposure. Over time, this changes the structure of global trade, and here's the critical point. Once supply chains adapt, they do not automatically revert. Contracts signed with new partners do not vanish. Logistics networks built around new routes do not disappear. Investment decisions made to reduce political risk continue to shape behavior long after the original dispute fades from headlines. This is how temporary trade conflicts become permanent structural changes. In that sense, the aluminum case is a warning, not about Canada, not even about tariffs themselves, but about the limits of using price pressure as a substitute for strategy. If the goal is resilience, then the tools must match the ambition. That means energy policy that makes domestic production competitive. It means industrial policy that supports recycling, advanced materials, and efficiency. It means working with allies rather than treating them as interchangeable suppliers. And it means recognizing that in a highly integrated economy, strength comes as much from reliability as from leverage. There is also a political dimension that cannot be ignored. When the costs of a trade war show up in everyday life, higher prices, delayed projects, pressured jobs, public support erodes. What begins as a show of strength risks becoming a domestic liability. History is full of examples where economic pain outlasts the political memory of why it was imposed. For Canada, the lesson is different but equally important. Diversification is not just a defensive move. It is a form of strategic insurance. By reducing dependence on any single market, Canada increases its autonomy without needing to escalate conflict. This is a model that many medium-sized economies are likely to follow in an era of growing geopolitical uncertainty. So who wins this trade war? In the short term, nobody really does. The costs are real, and they are widely shared. In the long term, the winners will be those who adapt their systems rather than those who simply raise barriers. And that brings us to the final and most uncomfortable conclusion. Power in the modern global economy is not just about the ability to impose costs. It is about the ability to remain the market everyone else wants to rely on. Once that reputation starts to weaken, restoring it is far harder than raising any tariff. The aluminum dispute between the United States and Canada is a small conflict in a very large system, but it reveals something big. In a world of complex supply chains and fast-moving capital, economic warfare often hurts the attacker almost as much as the target, sometimes more.